VUWAE 15 took place over the summer of 1970-71. There were 8 scientists involved in this expedition, shown here in the bottom right-hand panel. You can see Dave Reed, who was a student, a graduate student at Victoria University, as was Rosie Askin. Peter Barrett was the leader. This was Peter's first expedition with VUWAE to Antarctica. He had arrived a few months earlier from the Ohio State University as a postdoctoral fellow. Rodney Grapes was then a PhD student at Vic at the time. Gavin Young was a vertebrate paleontologist who had been working at the Bureau of Mineral Resources in Australia, which was the forerunner of Geoscience Australia. Another paleontologist, vertebrate paleontologist, was Alex Ritchie, the right, a Scotsman. He was the curator of fossils from the Australian Museum in Sydney. John McPherson, also a graduate student. Myself, Barry Kohn, as the deputy leader of this expedition. And when we went into the field on this first occasion, Brian Porter also accompanied us, and he was the leader of Scott Base. And there was also a field assistant not shown here, Sean Norman, on the Allen Hills expedition part. I'll show you that later. The expedition received quite a lot of early publicity because this was the first time that a female student from Victoria University had been part of a VUWAE expedition. Rosemary Askin was then had completed BSc Honours. She was not the first female from New Zealand to go to Antarctica, but she was the first female student and on an expedition, which was basically partly a sledging expedition. And the head of the geology department and chairman of the university's Antarctic Research Committee had noted, Prof. Bob Clark had noted it had been very pleasant to be able to make this year's selection without discrimination. And there had always been some opposition for females to be able to fly down on US Navy planes to Antarctica. So Bob Clark was very persistent in this aspect as well. There was an idea of also having hovercraft in Antarctica for some sort of transport instead of toboggans and sledges or huskies and sledges, but this never transpired. A lot of the aims of VUWAE 15 geologically were based on findings made during VUWAE 13, which I had been a member 2 years before. And one of the findings on that expedition was these beautifully preserved fish fossils. As you can see here in the top left-hand panel, a beautiful crossopterygian jaw with this dual dentition, small fish-like teeth, and then larger molar tusks. And these fish were very important evolutionary because these were the fish which gave rise to the first land-based animals, tetrapods, in Devonian time. So these fish had armoured plates which had been preserved, so that this was considered to be very important scientifically. These fish had been reported from early expeditions, but the exposures of some of the fish fossils here were extremely rich and detailed. We also were going to invest in the bottom left here, the tillites, which were deposited by the large continental Permo-Carboniferous glaciers, continental ice sheets, as well as the, on the right here, you can see these beautiful Ferrar dolerites from 180 million years ago, which heralded the breakup of Gondwanaland. You can see the beautiful cooling columns here. And the top part, to give you an idea of the scale, above that break where the columns appear to end, that top part, just to give you an idea of scale, is about 250 metres. So those Victoria VUWAE 13 fossils made a lot of publicity, and it also reached the ears of some of these vertebrate paleontologists in Australia. And Peter just arrived, and so the plan for VUWAE 13, the 15, was to go back to the ice on basically a fishing expedition in part, and look for these fish jaws. And Alex Ritchie had written a piece here in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1970. And he was describing the importance of these air-breathing fish from Antarctica. So the goals of the expedition were to make detailed collections of Devonian fish fossils, to further investigate the sedimentary column, the Beacon supergroup, which overlay the crystalline basement here, and to look at the stratigraphy, petrography, paleogeography, paleobotany and paleobotany, and with an emphasis on exploring those late Paleozoic glacial beds in more detail. Studies of the ferrodolerites and associated rocks, particularly by Rodney Grapes and Dave Reed, who were petrologists, was also one of the aims of the expedition. And all the information was going to contribute to future mapping compilations of that area. So our expedition started in the south here, as you can see in the left-hand panel down the Boomerang Range. We were put in by Hercules, and then we particularly visited the Warren Range, where you saw those spectacular columns and the ferrodolerite, and that area was the site of those fish fossils which I described previously. And then we sledged northwards to those other mountains in that Skelton Neve area, and then eventually further north up into the Willett Range, all these areas being to the west of the dry valleys. And eventually some of the party went to the Allen Hills area. Later on, there was some measurements and work recorded in the dry valleys, and also to the Darwin Mountains to the south of this area of the Warren Range and the Boomerang Range area. Here you can see some field shots drilling out that fabulous fish jaw. The paleontologist had made paraffin wax molds that poured it on top to preserve the fossils, drilled out a slab, and then put them into cotton wool for transport back for reconstruction in the museum. You can see some of these bony armoured graveyards, basically, from these Devonian fish fossils. These fossils, as you can see from Bothrialepis here, these fish, they had a soft rear part which wasn't preserved, but a lot of the middle and front part of the fish was articulated by these bony armours, and the bony armour was what we're seeing preserved. And you can see an example of a skull here in the bottom right, with this beautiful ornamentation on these Devonian fish fossil armoured plates. And you can see that that opening there for the orbit for the eyes, as you can see on the reconstruction of Bothrialepis. These were quite close together. These were probably freshwater fish or brackish water fish. And at the end of our expedition, and based on some earlier expeditions, you can see all the areas now where these Devonian fish fossils have been found in some form or another. And there's another example here of a mold made of a beautiful fish jaw with this very strong dual dentition, lovely molar tusks, and the smaller fish-like dentition. This fish would have been something like 1.5 meters in length. These findings were reported widely already during the time of the expedition, and describing how this fish jaw had been drilled out and preserved in beeswax and paraffin wax, melted over it, and then carried back to New Zealand and then to Australia for further work. All in all, the scientific outcomes of VUWAE 15, 41 detailed geological sections were measured in the Beacon supergroup, 5 kilometres of strata, metre by metre, and sample collections were made for petrographic and chemical analysis, and paleogeographic measurements were made as well. Some of the richest deposits of fossil fish remains ever found in Antarctic were transported back, something like 1.5 tonnes of rock. Discovery of primitive plants and recognition of soil horizons and some of the best fossil plant collections ever made. Discovery of the first Permian glacial striations in Victoria Land, which tell us something about the nature of the directions of how this ice was moving, and other ancient glacial landforms. Samples were collected for detailed petrological studies of that Mount Warren dolerite and rhythmic banding and other Jurassic ferrodolerite sills in the Allen Hills area. All in all, geological data was collected over some 20,000 kilometres of Victoria Land for map compilations, and 10 scientific papers arose, 2 PhD theses, which I'll describe a bit later, based on the work of John McPherson and Rosie Askin, and all these contributed to the Cox et al. 2012 map of southern Victoria Land. Some of these findings here you can see in the top left, Devonian lycopod stems preserved very nicely. In the middle, a typical Glossopteris leaf, typical of the Permian time, and in the bottom right here, a Dicroidium Triassic fern-like plant preserved fossil. There was also, you can see in the top left here is the glacial striations. In the bottom left here, you can see the Aztec siltstone, part of the Beacon supergroup, which formed the PhD subject of John McPherson's thesis. These were basically alluvial plain overbank sedimentary deposits with beautifully preserved paleosols and lots of roots. And later on, it transpires that these roots were possibly hosted the first forests on the planet in Devonian time. And here they are recorded from the Aztec siltstone in Antarctica. On the top right, you can see some of this Beacon supergroup over which sections were measured. And these were done by Jacob Staff in the bottom right here, as you can see, metre by metre, faithfully recording all the details as we measured through the sections. All in all, VUWAE 15, we had 603 man days in Antarctica. And to show you an idea of the efficiency of an expedition like this, about 37% of the time was spent on geology. The rest of the time was made up of transport to and from Antarctica, to and from Scott Base into the field, organisation of expeditions at Scott Base prior to heading out in the field, transport in the field, sometimes by Hercules, sometimes by helicopter, depending on where we were working. Some of the time was spent on toboggan breakdowns, and this was partly because they were old, and we also were travelling on very hard blue ice and over sastrugi, which is quite tough terrain in some instances. And then there was time down due to inclement weather when one couldn't work because of storms or whiteouts in that part of the world. More publicity arose from this, based on this cartoon from the New Zealand Herald in 1970, December. And it was describing how 6 New Zealanders, a Scotsman and an Australian, have found the richest deposit of fossilised fish ever discovered in Antarctica. And the caption read, "Tell Poseidon over there to lay off staking claims and come and help this drill." At that time, the West Australian nickel company Poseidon was making the headlines due to what was reported to be a very rich find in drilling intersections from their sites in West Australia. At that time, it was the height of the Vietnam War. Nickel was in huge demand for the steel industry, and one of the largest suppliers, Inco, in America, a Canadian company at the time, was going through industrial strife. So there was a shortage on the market, nickel, and the nickel price had shot through the roof, and Poseidon shares were something like $300 a share at the time. And so that was making headlines as people were focusing on the share market. Well, it transpired that Poseidon eventually, their find, as reported, was not as rich as they had thought. and eventually the shares dropped in value markedly, and the company eventually was delisted from the share market, from the stock exchange. Just to recap now, this is our souvenir envelope from VUWAE 15. You can see all the signatures there and a bas-relief stamp. Let's see where everyone headed off. Well, Peter Barrett doesn't really need much introduction. He went on to set up the Antarctic Research Centre, which he led for more than 30 years prior to his retirement, published prolifically on stratigraphy, sedimentology, and all sorts of issues related to Antarctic research, represented New Zealand at many fora related to Antarctic research as well. Next to him, Dave Reed went on to do a PhD at Cape Town and became the professor of petrology there and retired a few years ago. John McPherson next to him, I'll come back to him in a minute. On the extreme right, the curator of fossils, Alex Ritchie, our Scotsman from Sydney, and he went on to reconstruct all this material of these fossil fish beautifully together with Gavin Young. Rodney Grapes finished a PhD at Vic in petrology, went on to do a postdoc in Japan, and came back to Vic, held a position at Vic, and also held professorial positions later on in Germany, in South Korea and China, and wrote many papers on petrology, and also some popular books on which you may have come across on, say, earthquakes. I think he wrote one on the 1855 and the 1848 earthquakes around Wellington. Gavin Young moved from the Bureau of Mineral Resources to the Australian National University, where he published many papers on the fish fossils, vertebrate fish fossils from Antarctica and other parts of the world. Rosie Askin did her PhD, starting with this expedition in Antarctica on palynology and paleobotany. One of the aims of her expedition was to try and recover some good record of palynology from spores and pollens from this part of the world. But many of these have been cooked up by the Ferrar dolerites, which intruded a lot of the Beacon sandstone. So one of the aims was to try and get some stratigraphic control from looking for well-preserved spores, pollen in the Beacon supergroup. Rosie completed her PhD at Victoria University and then went off to the Bird Pollen Institute at Ohio State University. And she then, from there, held academic positions in the University of Colorado and the University in California, and published prolifically on paleobotany and palynology. John McPherson also began his PhD during this expedition on the Aztec siltstone, completed his PhD in 1975, and later on went as a lecturer to the University of Cape Town. After that, moved to the US and held an academic position at the University of Texas in Arlington. Then later on moved on to Mobil, the hydrocarbons exploration company, which then was amalgamated with Exxon, became ExxonMobil, and John held a position there as an expert sedimentologist for many years, and later retired in about 10 years ago, roughly, but continues to consult in that field of sedimentology in particular. As for myself, I completed a PhD at Vic. It was not related on Antarctic stuff. I went on into academic career and held positions in Israel, United States, and Australia, and really specialized in the field of isotope geochronology. John, at the time he finished his PhD, he also published a coffee table book on footprints on a frozen continent, which turned out to be a bestseller. And in later years, John developed a video based on images in this book. And this is going to be the subject of tonight's presentation. So it's a video based on his best-selling book, which was Footprints on a Frozen Continent. So without any further ado, I'll introduce John to the audience tonight. Thank you very much.